I spent my last dollar here, but this shelf was hiding my father's unfinished work.
She was 18 and grieving. No home, no room to return to, no thread from her father's bench, just a cracked beeswax cake, and $1 she had earned mending a boot, and with that dollar she bought a waxed thread carding room standing forgotten outside Lynn, Essex County, Massachusetts. Since it vanished from county maps, in 1974 the north wall leaned 3 inches outward. Rain had opened a black seam through the roof. The county condemned it on October 3, 2022 for demolition, before the spring thaw. But behind its wax-warming shelf waited a narrow spool slot, unopened for 80 years, holding money orders and a notebook that would return her father's work to her. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Eliza Hart had been carding her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she sorted everything into straight, patient rows. Buttons beside her mother's sewing machine, nails beneath the cellar stairs, beans drying on dish towels. When tangled shoemaker's linen arrived at her father's bench, she sat on an overturned crate and separated the strands until each one lay smooth enough to catch the afternoon light. Her mother, Ruth, had once made collars for a garment contractor in Salem. Years of close stitching had weakened her eyes, and she learned to recognize people by their footsteps. After illness took her from the factory, she lived quietly under the authority of her older sister, Vera Pike, surrendering one household decision after another. Eliza's true schooling happened every Saturday beside her father, Gideon Hart. He repaired work boots in a narrow rented room that smelled of leather, pine rosin, and warm beeswax. At 7 in the morning, he lit the alcohol lamp beneath a shallow copper pan. Eliza measured 3 lengths of linen, combed them between steel teeth, and twisted the strands against her knee. Gideon showed her how to pull the cord through wax while it was warm enough to yield but not hot enough to soak the fibers. Then they tested it between 2 wooden pegs. A good cord hummed. A weak one answered with a soft, feathery snap. Thread tells the truth before the shoe does. Gideon meant that failure began in places most people never inspected. Eliza carried the sentence beyond the bench, listening for strain in floorboards, promises, and voices. He died on August 19th after 11 weeks of lung illness. When Eliza returned from the hospital office with his death certificate folded inside her coat, his rented room had already been cleared. Vera had sold the linen stock, wax pans, awls, carding combs, and Gideon's oak thread box to a dealer whose name she refused to provide. Only a broken cake of beeswax remained beneath the bench. Vera governed the house through lowered shades and careful silences. She kept receipts beneath a glass paperweight and locked the pantry between meals. She never raised her voice. When Eliza asked about the tools, Vera aligned the edges of 3 envelopes, pressed them flat, and said the proceeds had paid legitimate expenses. Ruth sat nearby, rubbing the seam of her sleeve until the cloth shone. On September 6th, Vera placed Eliza's canvas bag beside the kitchen door. Inside were 2 dresses, Gideon's death certificate, a comb, and the beeswax cake wrapped in newspaper. Rain tapped the window above the sink. Vera rested one hand upon the brass doorknob. "Take your bag and leave before sundown, Eliza." Ruth occupied her usual chair beneath the clock. Eliza waited for her to object, or at least to look up. Instead, her mother folded a dish towel once, then again, hiding its already straight edges inside smaller ones. That precise motion was her answer. Eliza lifted the bag, felt the hard square of wax against her hip, and stepped into the rain. For 6 weeks, she moved eastward through Massachusetts. In Worcester, she slept 4 nights in the women's waiting room at Union Station until a guard began recognizing her coat. Her $9.74 became $7 after bread, milk, and a bar of soap. In Marlborough, she spent 2 nights beneath the covered loading platform of a closed feed store, using flattened cartons against the concrete. A church basement in Framingham gave her a cot for 5 evenings, but no bed could be held longer while others waited. She earned 75 cents hemming an apron and 50 more repairing a split canvas valise. In Boston, she slept sitting upright in the South Station concourse, her bag looped around both ankles. A policeman directed her to a shelter on Harrison Avenue, where the radiators clanged until dawn, and every mattress was occupied. She rested on a wooden chair beside the laundry room. By the 6th Monday, her money had fallen to $1. She had protected it through hunger, because Gideon had taught her never to spend the last sound piece of anything. The coin would buy a meal, but only once. She carried it in the small watch pocket of her skirt and touched it whenever a shop window released the smell of coffee. That afternoon, she entered the Boston Public Library to escape a cold rain. Near the municipal notices, below advertisements for estate cleanouts and roofing labor, a narrow classified had been pinned crookedly to the board Essex County Surplus Structure for owner occupancy, $1 quit claim, former waxed thread carding room, Lynn outskirts, unsafe, no utilities. Demolition, authorized spring. 2023, a county stamp covered one corner. Someone had written a transportation voucher available in blue pencil. Eliza read the notice 3 times. Waxed thread was not shelter, food, or certainty. It was simply the first language she had ever understood. At the reference desk, she requested a street map, copied the clerk's address onto the back of Gideon's death certificate, and enclosed her last dollar in a library donation envelope so it would not slip through the tear in her pocket. The following morning, carrying the beeswax her aunt had overlooked, Eliza Hart began walking toward the only door her father's work had left unlocked. The bus pulled away from South Station before sunrise, carrying Eliza north beneath windows filmed with November rain. Her county voucher covered the fare only as far as Peabody Square, where the driver pointed toward Lynn and told her the remaining distance was nearly 9 miles. She walked south with her canvas bag under one arm, following wet roads until darkness erased the painted lines. That night, she found an empty hay barn behind a stone wall near Linfield. The doors had been chained, but one board had loosened enough for her to enter sideways. She buried her shoes beneath dry hay and wrapped her coat around the bag containing Gideon's certificate. At dawn, a thermometer outside a farmhouse kitchen read 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost silvered the pasture, and each breath hurt the back of her throat. By 9, chimneys and brick buildings replaced the open ground. Lynn announced itself through work already underway. Doyle's Cafe washing its front windows. Bell's Bakery sliding bread onto wire racks. North Shore Pharmacy raising a striped awning. Reed Hardware stacking salt bags beside the door. And Bay State Shoe Repair, switching on a red lamp above rows of waiting boots. Eliza slowed at the last window. A spool of waxed linen stood beside the register, but she continued toward the county office. The Essex County Surplus Property Desk occupied a high-ceilinged room inside a limestone annex. Fluorescent tubes hummed above metal filing cabinets, and damp coats had left dark crescents on the tile. Behind the counter sat a woman with a pale scar crossing the knuckle of her right thumb. Her brass nameplate read, Mary Ann Vale, Deputy Clerk. Eliza placed the classified notice, the donation envelope, and Gideon's death certificate on the counter. Mary Ann inspected the dollar through the paper before opening the property folder. Inside were photographs of a sagging roof, survey notes, and a condemnation order printed on yellow stock. You understand there is no working water? Yes, ma'am. You understand the electric service was removed. Yes, ma'am. The chimney may be structurally unsound. Yes, ma'am. And stabilization must begin before March demolition. Yes, ma'am. Marianne looked over the rims of her glasses. Eliza's coat was still beaded with rain, and a straw stem from the barn clung to one sleeve. Owner occupancy means you sleep there. I understand. The clerk turned the quitclaim deed toward her and indicated 3 marked lines. Eliza signed each one slowly, using her full name as Gideon had taught her. Marianne carried the document to a side table, positioned it beneath a heavy brass stamp, and pressed the long handle until the mechanism struck, with a sound like a door closing in an empty house. She returned the deed, a temporary occupancy permit, and directions written on county stationery. Eliza was to follow Boston Street west, turn north onto Walnut Street, pass the entrance to Lynn Woods, and continue 8/10 of a mile beyond a disused pumping road. 2 leaning stone posts marked the parcel. The structure stood another 400 yards behind them. Marianne began closing the folder, then stopped with her fingers resting on the surname. Gideon Hart, she said. Was he the boot repair man? Eliza held the edge of the counter. He was my father. The clerk removed her glasses. The small change made her face appear older. Gideon had visited this office every October for 11 years. He arrived with a leather folio tied by cord and requested the same obsolete parcel file. He believed a Hart relative had operated the thread room before the Second World War, though the records ended with a woman named Matilda Hart and a closure notice dated February 2nd, 1942. Gideon had copied deeds, trade permits, and 1 smoke-damaged inventory, paying 10 cents per page. He asked us not to tear the place down, Marianne said. He never said why. Did he try to buy it? Every year. The county could not transfer it while the boundary dispute remained open. The dispute had finally been settled 7 weeks earlier, 3 days before Gideon entered the hospital. Marianne had mailed notice to his repair room, but the envelope came back stamped, vacant. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and removed a narrow parcel map bearing his penciled notes. Beside the rear wall, Gideon had drawn a small square and written warming shelf. Check depth. Eliza recognized the compact lettering immediately. He formed every lowercase g as if tying a knot. Marianne made a copy of the map without charging her. Then she smoothed the original dollar bill and placed it in the same drawer instead of sending it to the cashier. County property should be paid for properly, she said. I will enter it at closing. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. Eliza followed Boston Street while delivery trucks sent gray water over the curb. Walnut Street rose gradually beside the dark acreage of Lynn Woods. Houses became farther apart, their yards deep with leaves. Near the pumping road, an older woman in a blue wool cap was gathering fallen branches beside a stone wall. A broad brown dog stood near her boots, watching Eliza without barking. The woman introduced herself as Miriam Knox, and the dog as Bishop. When Eliza showed her the county directions, Miriam pointed beyond a stand of black walnut trees. That roof has been waiting longer than I have. Bishop accompanied Eliza as far as the stone posts, then sat down as if respecting an old boundary. The path beyond them had narrowed beneath sumac and winterberry. Walnut shells cracked under Eliza's heels. At the end stood a timber-framed building roughly 24 feet wide and 32 feet long, its lower walls made of fieldstone, and its upper courses covered in weathered cedar boards. The salt box roof dipped along the northern slope. A square brick chimney leaned slightly east, and an iron sign hung from one surviving chain above the door. Heart and row-wax thread and cordage Eliza touched the first name. Rust flaked beneath her thumb. The door resisted until she lifted it by the handle and pushed with one shoulder. Hinges complained inside the jam. Cold air escaped carrying wet ash, mouse droppings, old wax, and the faint animal sweetness of rotting wood. The taste of plaster dust settled on her tongue. The front room held a counter, 2 stools, and shelving gray with neglect. Rain struck a metal pan left beneath the roof seam, each drop sounding separately. When Eliza crossed the floor, warped boards shifted under her weight and sent a tremor into the counter. She moved slowly, learning where the building answered. A narrow doorway opened into the workroom. Her fingers found linen fibers caught in the wallboards, still stiff with blackened wax. Beneath the window stood a long, warming shelf surfaced with tin. Its edge was cold and smooth, except where shallow grooves had been worn by years of passing thread. Behind it, a thin plank covered part of the wall, but darkness prevented her from seeing how it was fastened. She did not touch it yet. The back room contained an iron stove, a stone sink without a pump handle, and a small cupboard smelling of dried apples. She ate half a bread heel saved from the shelter, drank from the bottle filled at the county office, and spread newspaper across the safest section of floor. That night, wind entered through the roof seam and traveled along the rafters with a low, deliberate whistle. Eliza lay in her coat with the deed beneath her head, and Gideon's beeswax cake held inside one closed hand. Beyond the boards, walnut branches moved against the siding like thread drawn slowly over teeth. Some things wait because they have not finished their work. At first light, Eliza carried the metal pail behind the building and followed a line of flat stones to the well. Its wooden cover had split, but the water stood clear 12 feet below. She tied the pail to an old sash cord, lowered it without disturbing the silt, and boiled every cup she drank. The outhouse leaned toward the creek, its door held closed by a bent spoon driven through a leather loop. During the first 3 days, she swept one room at a time and memorized the floor. The board beside the front counter groaned deeply. 2 planks near the stove clicked. The workroom remained quiet, except along the western wall, where a short creak traveled ahead of her weight. She marked each unsafe place with chalk borrowed from Miriam Knox. On the 4th morning, Eliza walked back to Reed Hardware. The shop smelled of machine oil, fertilizer, and the iron dust produced by a key grinder near the register. Its owner, Vernon Reed, wore a leather guard over the missing end of his left index finger. He listened without interrupting as Eliza explained the deed, the condemned chimney, and the money she did not possess. What can you pay today? Nothing without losing food. What can you do? I can work carefully. Vernon pulled a ruled account book from beneath the counter. He wrote Heart Thread Room across the top of a blank page and set a 90-day limit. From a box of discarded publications, he added a stained copy of Home Repairs for New England Houses. Read the warnings before the instructions. Eliza chose only what she could carry: a used claw hammer for $3.25, a stiff chimney brush for $4.80, 30 feet of rope for $2.10, a steel pry bar for $3.60, and a gallon of lamp kerosene for $1.15. Vernon recorded every price, wrapped the brush in brown paper, and handed her 6 worn screws from his salvage drawer without adding them to the account. The chimney came first because the nights were falling below freezing. Eliza studied the manual beneath the front window, then climbed onto the lower roof with the rope around her waist and the brush tied separately. She covered the stove opening with damp cloth, removed the rusted flue cap, and lowered the brush 1 foot at a time. At 7 feet, it stopped. She rotated the handle clockwise, raised it 6 inches, and drove it down again. Dry creosote fell inside the chimney with a sound like gravel poured into a bucket. The obstruction proved to be a bird's nest compressed beneath a shelf of glazed soot. Eliza worked from above for 3 hours, then returned indoors and scraped the lower throat with a flattened fireplace shovel. Black dust entered her cuffs and settled along her eyelashes. The second day, She passed the brush through each flue section 12 times. She held a mirror beneath the opening and angled it toward noon light until she could see a pale square of sky. The mortar joints remained rough, but unbroken above the smoke chamber. After 8 hours and 40 minutes of work, she carried 2 pails of creosote and nest material outside. She built the first fire with 3 dry twigs, 2 split pieces of walnut, and 1 folded strip of newspaper. Smoke hesitated at the stove collar, then rose cleanly. Eliza kept the flame small for an hour, warming the masonry slowly so trapped moisture would not fracture it. For her first hot meal, she simmered a potato and half an onion in a dented saucepan Miriam had left by the door. She added salt from a paper packet saved at the shelter. Steam softened the room's smell, and heat reached the floorboards around her boots. She ate from the pan while reading the chimney chapter again. Only after the fire proved dependable did she examine the workroom. The long bench held an iron carding comb with 3 missing teeth, a brass wax ladle darkened underneath, 2 wooden twisting hooks, a bench clamp faced with leather, a foot treadle connected to nothing, and a shallow drawer filled with hardened flax dust. On the wall hung a measuring wheel marked in yards. Beneath it stood a narrow oak rack with spaces for 24 spools, though every spindle was empty. The tin-covered warming shelf ran 6 feet along the western wall. A channel beneath its lip would once have carried wax drippings into a removable tray. Eliza cleaned it with a wooden scraper, preserving the old residue instead of cutting into the tin. At the left end, she found a circle the size of a spool flange, buried under gray wax. She warmed the surface with a cloth dipped in hot water. The wax softened at its edges, revealing a cedar disc fitted flush into the shelf support. 2 holes had been drilled through its face. They were too evenly spaced for insect damage. Eliza tapped the shelf from right to left with the hammer handle. Most of it answered with a dense wooden knock. Above the cedar disc, the sound became higher and slightly hollow. She pressed down with both hands. The right side did not move, but the left lowered perhaps 1/16 of an inch and returned when she released it. Something behind the shelf was carrying weight. She emptied the oak spool rack and lifted it. 40 pounds, perhaps less. Then she tried the warming shelf. Though narrower, its left section resisted as if loaded with iron. Gideon's penciled words returned to her. Check depth. Eliza inserted the points of a small pair of scissors into the disc's 2 holes and turned counterclockwise. Nothing moved. She heated the cedar with her palm, cleared another ring of wax, and tried again using the twisting hook for leverage. The disc rotated a quarter turn. Behind it waited a square iron shaft. 1 wooden hook fit the shaft closely enough to serve as a key. Eliza turned it until a hidden latch released. The thin wall plank behind the shelf moved forward, carrying its nails with it. They were not nails at all, but shortened iron pins blackened to resemble them. The opening was 9 inches wide and nearly 4 feet deep. A horizontal spool slot built between doubled studs. Eliza tested its lower surface with the hammer handle before reaching inside. The first object she drew out was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed linen. It was followed by a second package, then a third. At the rear sat a rectangular tin box so heavy that she had to support it with both forearms. She arranged everything on the workbench in the order removed. The first oilcloth bundle contained 2 carding combs whose steel teeth remained straight, a cocobolo burnisher, 3 bone folders, and a small copper warming cup. Each tool carried a stamped mark, a spool crossed by 2 strands. The handles had been rubbed smooth by a right hand. The second bundle held unbleached linen skeins wrapped around cedar cores. Age had yellowed their outer layers, yet strands from the center remained dry and strong. Beside them lay 4 dark cakes made from beeswax and pine rosin. Eliza drew 1 thread across a cake, twisted it against her knee and tested it between her fingers. It hummed. The third package contained a black repair notebook, its canvas cover polished at the corners. The earliest pages recorded paying customers, leather types, cord gauges, and completed work. Later pages listed names followed by no charge. Samuel Pike, mill closure. Irene Walsh, seeking kitchen work. Thomas Bell, 3 weeks between ships. Besides several entries, the writer had added one quiet sentence. Sound shoes returned before sunrise. Eliza opened the tin box last. A sealed envelope lay on top, addressed in brown ink. My dear one, whoever you are. Beneath it were packets of money orders protected between sheets of waxed paper. The first had been purchased for $25, the next for $50. Later packets contained orders for $100 and $500, each bearing bank stamps, serial numbers, and the same careful signature. Eliza counted them once, wrote each amount in the notebook's empty margin, then counted again from the opposite direction. The money orders totaled exactly $26,400. A cotton purse beneath them held old coins, Barber dimes, standing Liberty quarters, walking Liberty, $50, and 9 Morgan silver dollars. Their face value came to $11.73. Eliza separated each denomination into rows and checked the total twice. At the bottom rested a First World War victory medal. The bronze had darkened around the figure on its face, and the rainbow ribbon had faded almost white at one edge. On the reverse of its suspension bar, someone had scratched E. Hart, 1918. The sealed letter remained beside Eliza's hand. She turned it over, studied the unbroken wax, and placed it back upon the tin. Discovery had already changed the dimensions of the room. Reading could wait until daylight made every word honest. Outside, the creek carried leaves beneath a skin of moonlight. Eliza sat on the lowest stone step with the repair notebook closed across her knees. Water divided around a fallen branch, joined itself again, and continued toward the dark trees. Some things wait because they have not finished their work. Morning entered through the broken eastern pane and reached the sealed envelope before it touched Eliza's face. She warmed water, washed the soot from her hands, and placed the letter beside the repair notebook. The first word carried an open loop in its Y and a square dot above the I. Gideon had formed letters the same way. He had copied this hand before teaching his own. Eliza eased a bone folder beneath the wax seal. It lifted whole, bearing the crossed spool mark. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then the old release still works, and you approach the shelf with greater patience than the men who once searched this room with crowbars. My name is Matilda Rowe Hart, doctor. Helen Mercer of Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston has diagnosed fibrosis of both lungs. She has advised me to put my affairs in order while my hand remains steady. I am not afraid of finishing. I am concerned only that the work may be mistaken for property and sold by someone who never learned its use. 4 generations brought us here. Abigail Rowe carded sail thread in Salem in 1788. Her daughter Mercy married a leather cutter and carried the method to Marblehead in 1817. Mercy's daughter Rebecca came to Lynn in 1856 and opened this room with Samuel Hart on May 4th, 1878. I was born upstairs in 1878 and began at the warming shelf when I could reach it. The Hart name entered the sign, but the Rowe women carried the measurements. My younger brother Elias left after a quarrel in 1908. We exchanged no letters for more than 30 years. He died serving with the 26th Division in France during the Great War, and his medal was returned to me with no address for the family he had begun elsewhere. If you descend from Elias, the silence was ours, not yours. Keep the medal until you can place his name where it will be spoken carefully. The trade closed on February 2, 1942. Wartime contracts went to larger cordage mills, and my hands could no longer maintain the orders. The money orders represent saved earnings, unpaid family shares, and deposits held for workers who never returned. Confirm every serial number before using them. Take nothing merely because you found it. If you mean to prepare thread again, heat beeswax between 145 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Mix 4 parts wax to 1 part pine rosin for ordinary boot cord. For heavy soles, twist 3 strands at 18 turns per foot, then let the cord rest 20 minutes before waxing. Test each finished length against 10 pounds of steady pull. A sudden jerk proves only the hand, not the thread. The black notebook matters more than the money. The names marked no charge belong to people between jobs, newly arrived workers, widows, and men walking home from the harbor. A repaired shoe did not rescue them. It gave them one less injury while they rescued themselves. Inheritance is not what rests in a box. It is the bench-made level, the tool cleaned before storage, and the work completed for someone who cannot yet repay it. If this room becomes yours, do not preserve it as a shrine. Make it useful. Leave evidence that careful hands were here. Behind the back door, 12 paces toward the creek, a low granite marker bears our spool sign. Let it remain. It marks the first boundary Rebecca measured herself. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Matilda Rowe. Hart, February 6th, 1942. Eliza read the letter twice. The second time, she rested one finger beneath each technical instruction, as though following a line of cord. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, neither adding a new one nor pressing the old ones flatter. The wax seal returned to the envelope inside a square of clean paper. She carried the letter through the back door. Frost remained beneath the walnut trees, and the creek moved darkly between rims of ice. Beginning at the threshold, she measured 12 paces toward the water. Dead grass concealed a stone no higher than her ankle. Eliza cleared it with both hands. The dressed granite bore a shallow spool crossed by 2 strands, the same mark stamped into the heirloom tools. Moss filled the lower groove. She cleaned only enough to see the shape, leaving the oldest growth undisturbed. At the stone's base lay a thin line of white quartz pointing back toward the workroom. Inside, she set the copper warming lamp upon the bench. Its reservoir still held the dry smell of old fuel, but the wick had hardened. Eliza cut a fresh wick from one damaged linen strand, filled the cup with a spoonful of kerosene, and waited until the fibers darkened. The flame rose no taller than her thumbnail. Warm copper released a faint trace of pine rosin. She placed Gideon's cracked beeswax cake beside it. For several minutes, Eliza considered the distance between keeping and owning. Marianne Vale had preserved an unanswered file instead of throwing it away. Vernon Reed had opened an account without requiring proof that Hope could make a payment. Miriam Knox had left a saucepan and walked home without waiting to be thanked. Even Bishop had stopped at the boundary, as if a ruined place deserved courtesy. None of those acts had changed the whole of her circumstances. Each had removed one burden at the hour when one burden was enough. Before we move forward, think of one small kindness someone once gave you and they could not have known how badly you needed it. Was it a meal, a ride, a tool, or simply a person making room beside them? If you remember, tell us about it in the comments. Small kindnesses deserve somewhere to remain. Eliza copied the money order serial numbers into a separate ledger, but spent nothing. The county office would need to verify their validity, and she would need to learn whether the funds carried legal claims. She placed the tin box beneath the workbench, locked the room with the iron latch, and kept Matilda's letter inside her coat. That evening, she warmed another potato on the stove. Before lying down, she wrapped the carding combs, copper lamp, bone folders, and metal in clean cloth. She arranged them beside her blanket, close enough that her hand could find the bundle in darkness. The room settled around their returned weight. Snow began on December 1st and left 4.5 inches across the roof. The weight sharpened the sag above the workroom, where meltwater darkened one rafter and fell beside the warming shelf. Eliza read the roofing chapter 3 times before carrying a ruler into the attic. The 2 slopes measured 34 by 16 feet each. Allowing 10% for breakage and overlap, she calculated 19 bundles of cedar shingles, 600 square feet of roofing felt, and 14 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Vernon Reed checked her arithmetic without changing it. Then he reached beneath his counter and gave her a roofing hatchet whose worn handle had belonged to his older brother. He would dislike it sitting idle. The following morning, 71-year-old Harlan Voss appeared carrying a carpenter's square and a coil of safety rope. He had roofed houses from Gloucester to Cambridge before his knees forced him from ladders. Eliza offered meals, labor, and eventual payment. Harlan refused all, saying only that a building under sentence should receive a fair hearing. They worked 11 days. Eliza removed shingles in sections small enough to cover before dark. Where the northern slope had bent, Harlan showed her how to fasten a sister rafter beside the weakened timber, drawing the 2 together with clamps before driving structural screws. They snapped a chalk line every 5 inches so the new courses would remain straight. Harlan taught a 3-stroke method for each nail: 1 tap to place it, 1 strike to drive it, and 1 lighter stroke to seat the head, without crushing cedar. "That nail's proud," said it again. When a shingle split beneath Eliza's hatchet, he stopped her hand. "Pull it. The split will travel." On December 15th, they trimmed the final ridge shingles and fitted a copper cap above them. Snowmelt passed down both slopes without entering the attic. Harlan stood in the yard, looked along the straight ridge, and gave 1 small nod before walking home. The roof made the chimney's condition more urgent. Once the masonry dried, Eliza found spalling bricks beneath the eastern shoulder and mortar that powdered when touched with a fingernail. Cleaning had opened the flue, but several joints near the roof line had lost almost half their depth. She erected a narrow work platform inside the attic and removed only mortar loose enough to fall under a hand rake. Vernon supplied natural hydraulic lime and screened fire clay. Eliza mixed 1 part lime to 2 parts fire clay, adding water by spoonfuls until a pressed ball held its shape without coating her palm. For 3 weeks, daytime temperatures remained in the 20s. Gloves made the narrow joints impossible to fill, so she worked barehanded with a pointing trowel, packing mortar from the back of each joint toward the face. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb. She descended, held them near the stove until they ached, then returned before the mix stiffened. 2 badly spalled bricks came free beneath the flue shoulder. Harlan helped her choose salvaged replacements of the same dimensions, but Eliza bedded and tooled them herself. She kept the new joints recessed 1/8 inch, so they matched the weathered work around them rather than pretending to be original. On January 27th, after a 7-day cure, she built a test fire from dry walnut and held a strip of tissue near the stove door. The paper bent inward at once. Outside, a thin column of smoke rose past the new copper cap, without drifting beneath the eaves. The chimney drew clean. The floor weighted beneath everything they had dropped upon it: soot, lime, cedar splinters, and bent nails. Eliza lifted the damaged boards in the front room and found white pine planks beneath later plywood patches. The surviving boards were fastened with hand-cut rose head nails, each head slightly different from the next. She salvaged every sound nail by easing it upward over a wooden block. Reed Hardware found replacement white pine from a dismantled meeting house, dry enough to match the old floor. Eliza cut each repair to follow the irregular joist spacing and bored pilot holes before returning the rose head nails with the roofing hatchet's flat face. Vernon rented her a random orbit sander for $14 per day. She closed the workroom door, covered the spool slot, and made 3 passes across the front and back rooms. 80 grit to remove grime and ridges, 120 to level the grain, then 220 for the final surface. At every doorway, she'd finished by hand, so the machine would not hollow the edges. The first coat of linseed and tung floor oil disappeared into the pine before she reached the far wall. She waited overnight, rubbed away the excess, and applied 2 thinner coats with folded cotton. After the third, the rooms remained untouched for a 48-hour cure. The boards shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, where generations of boots had compressed the grain. There was one morning when Eliza did none of it. She woke before dawn with Gideon's death certificate on the table and could not make herself lift a tool. At the marsh below the creek, a great blue heron stood in shallow water, one leg folded beneath its body. Eliza watched from sunrise until the bird opened its wings near noon. She returned to the room, heated soup, and let the idle day remain idle. By February, the restored floor carried light cleanly toward the windows. There were 8 of them. 3 had no glass, 4 held cracked panes secured with tape or cloth, and 1 contained a wavering hand-blown pane marked 1788 in a corner. Matilda's records identified it as glass saved from Abigail Rose, Salem workroom, and installed here when the building opened. Eliza removed that sash first. She laid it flat on padded boards, marked the pane's orientation, and worked the old putty loose with gentle heat rather than forcing the glass. The 1788 pane remained in its original sash. She replaced only the brittle glazing around it. For the empty and cracked windows, Vernon located salvage cylinder glass, close in thickness to the surviving panes. Eliza bedded each piece in a thin ribbon of DAP 33 glazing putty, pressed it until the interior edge showed an even seal, then set glazing points 8 inches apart. She rolled the finished putty between her palms, packed it against the glass, and drew a putty knife along the bevel in one uninterrupted pass. 4 sash cords had rotted inside their pockets. Eliza threaded 1/4-inch cotton sash cord over each pulley, tied a figure-8 knot at the counterweight, and tested the travel before replacing the access panel. The repaired sashes stayed open without sticks and closed without dropping. The final window faced the walnut trees. As Eliza tooled the lower bead, a chickadee landed on a branch just beyond the glass. Its feet scarcely bent the twig. She stopped with the putty knife held level until the bird turned its black-capped head, inspected the room, and flew toward the creek. Eliza completed the bevel and wiped the pane clean. Late February exposed those 3 failed plaster patches beside the chimney. Each had been laid over loose material, and all 3 separated from the wall when Eliza tested them with the handle of her putty knife. Beneath them remained horsehair plaster, keyed around hand-split oak lath. She cleaned every opening back to firm edges and dampened the old work so it would not steal water from the repair. Vernon found a paper bag of horsehair in his storeroom, saved by his brother, from a demolished stable. Eliza mixed it into lime plaster until each trowelful held fine, dark strands. The first coat was pressed through the lath and scored horizontally. Over it she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat, leveled with a wooden float, and allowed it to cure for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The final coat measured 1/8 inch and followed the slight waves of the original wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it quietly, not as a promise about time, but as a judgment on the fit. Help continued arriving without arrangement. Doris Bell, owner of Doyle's Cafe, had a flower-white streak in her dark hair that never disappeared before noon. Twice a week she left paper bags on the doorstep containing soup, bread ends, or bruised apples suitable for cooking. When Eliza brought coins to the cafe, Doris closed her fingers around them and pushed them back. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." 19-year-old Caleb Shaw, arrived on a blue Schwinn bicycle, with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. His ears reddened before the rest of his face in cold weather. Without asking permission, he divided the fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths and stacked them beneath the new eaves. Eliza offered to credit his labor against future repair work. He shook his head. "My mother said, about your grandfather." Gideon had once resold Mrs. Shaw's nursing shoes during a hospital strike and refused payment until her wages resumed. Caleb returned on 3 Saturdays, always leaving before supper and always sweeping the chips into a neat pile. Reverend Isaac Boyd passed the property each morning on his walk toward the infirmary. He was a narrow man with silver eyebrows and a coat repaired at both elbows. When ice covered the path, he scattered ash from a small bucket so Eliza could carry water safely from the well. At the stone posts, he tipped his hat and offered the same 4-word prayer. "May this work endure." The cellar had waited while roof water and chimney dust occupied every dry hour. Eliza did not enter it until February 11th. 7 granite steps descended beneath the back room to a 12 by 15-foot floor laid in fieldstone. The air smelled of mineral water and old apples, but the walls remained plumb. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, bearing the crossed spool mark. Its edges were tight against surrounding stones, and one corner showed the faint scar of an earlier pry bar. Eliza ran her hand over the carving and left the slab where it was. Matilda had warned against confusing discovery with permission. Beneath the 3rd step, she noticed an oak grain running contrary to the granite. A small box had been wedged into the shadow behind the riser. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped like a spool crossed by 2 strands. Under the key rested a tin type dated 1903. It showed a young woman outside the unrestored thread room, holding a carding comb against her apron. Her chin, narrow shoulders, and direct gray eyes resembled Eliza so closely that the photograph seemed less like history than an old mirror. The inscription read, "Matilda Hart, daughter of Rebecca Hart, age 25, summer of 1903. Eliza carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel. She tried it in the front door, the tin box, the spool compartment, and the repair notebook drawer. It fit none of them. The key remained beside the copper lamp, waiting without explanation. During March, snow retreated into gray ridges beneath the stone walls. The creek grew loud with meltwater, and yellow-green catkins lengthened on the walnut branches. By April, the room was dry enough for work, but Eliza did not attempt to reopen the full trade. She selected $1 Morgan from the cache and exchanged it with a collector for linen, beeswax, and pine rosin of known quality. She practiced on 12-inch samples, recording heat, twist, and breaking strength. Some cords frayed, others carried too much wax and cracked when bent. She kept every failure in a labeled drawer. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 3, 2024, Eliza completed her first full hank of waxed boot cord. It measured 20 yards and contained 3 linen strands, twisted at 18 turns per foot. She warmed a 4-to-1 mixture of beeswax and pine rosin to 148 degrees, drew the cord through twice, and let it rest overnight beneath a linen cloth. The following morning, she suspended 10 pounds from one end. The cord lengthened slightly, held for 60 seconds, and returned almost to its original measure. When she pulled it between the wooden test pegs, it gave a low, clean hum. Eliza tied the hank with one narrow strand and entered the result in Matilda's repair notebook. She did not call it perfect. She wrote sound. The interior had become spare and usable. Restored white pine floors carried winter light from the old windows. Carding comb stood beside the warming shelf, and the repaired chimney kept the back room evenly warm. The workbench bore cuts and wax stains again. Nothing had been polished beyond the needs of the hand. The brass key remained unexplained until a December wind broke a dead limb, from the oldest walnut tree. Beneath the torn bark, Eliza saw a green edge that did not belong to wood. A narrow copper plate had been set into the trunk long ago, then covered as the tree grew around it. She cleaned the plate and found a keyway beneath a rotating spool-shaped cover. The brass key turned once. Inside the tree was a cylindrical copper case sealed with waxed thread. Eliza carried it indoors before opening it. The case held a folded 48-star American flag, protected between sheets of oiled linen, and a short note written by Eliza Hart. November 11th, 1918, Matilda. The factory whistles have sounded for the armistice, but Elias will not return with the others. Fold this flag without ceremony and keep it where the living tree can hold what our hands cannot. Your brother left angry. Do not let anger become the only account of him. He carded his first thread at this bench. He repaired harbor boots without charging men whose pay was late. Whatever words passed between you, his work was patient, before either of you understood patience. When someone comes who carries his name or his manner, give them the medal and the truth together. Neither should travel alone. Your mother, Rebecca Rowe. Hart. The note explained why Matilda had guarded Elias's medal and why Gideon had spent 11 Octobers studying the parcel. He had found the record of Elias's descendants, but never reached the compartment that proved the connection. County archives supplied the remaining facts. Elias Hart had died near Verdun on October 17, 1918, while serving with Massachusetts soldiers of the 26th Division. A memorial inscription bearing his name stood in Pine Grove Cemetery in Lynn, though his remains had been buried in France. On November 11, 2024, the anniversary of the armistice, Eliza carried the Victory Medal to Pine Grove Cemetery. Marianne Vale and a local veterans archivist accompanied her. There were no speeches. They placed the medal beside Elias's inscription, folded the old flag once in his honor, and stood quietly until the 11 o'clock bells ended. The money orders required nearly a year of examination. Bank historians verified the serial numbers, and a probate court determined that the instruments belonged to the Hart Thread Room Trust rather than to Eliza personally. She could have petitioned to dissolve the trust. She chose not to. Only 4 coins ever left the cotton purse. The first Morgan dollar purchased her practice materials. A barber dime was set beneath the repaired warming shelf with the date scratched beside it. 1/4 paid for cord used on a mill worker's boots when he was between paychecks. A $50 bought paper for the first 40 repair records. The remaining coins, money orders, Rebecca's flag, Elias's medal, and copies of both letters went into a modern fireproof box behind the restored spool panel. Eliza wrote 2 words on its cotton wrapper. The next one. Roofing debt was paid through ordinary labor. Eliza washed dishes at Doyle's Cafe before sunrise, repaired leather bags in the afternoon, and spent evenings carding test cord. Vernon accepted $5 whenever she had $5 and never moved his finger down the account page to hurry her. By the second winter, the balance reached 0. The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned 1 index card to the cafe corkboard. Waxed linen boot cordsmall repairs pay when work allows Walnut Street. The first request came from a dishwasher whose boot stitching had failed near the heel. The second came from a delivery driver. Within 3 months, more than 40 names filled a handwritten mailing list, though Eliza sent only brief notes when a batch of cord was ready. She accepted no work she could not complete carefully. Customers sometimes waited 2 weeks. Those without money found the words "no charge" entered beside their names in the black notebook, followed by the date their shoes were returned. Caleb came back in April carrying a long object wrapped in a moving blanket. He had grown broader through the shoulders, though his ears still reddened before his face. During 2 years in a cabinet shop, he had saved black walnut offcuts from furniture orders. From them he had carved a sign matching the weathered lettering above Eliza's door. The original still read, Heart and Row, waxed thread and cordage. Caleb's smaller board contained only 2 words, daughters. There were daughters before there were hearts, he said. Eliza ran her fingertips through the carved letters. They were not machine perfect. A chisel had left one shallow crescent beneath the ampersand, and she asked him not to remove it. They hung the addition below the old sign. Neither name displaced the other. In rain, both boards darkened to nearly the same color. That evening, Eliza opened a blank sheet of heavy paper. Matilda's letter lay to her left, Rebecca's note to her right, and Gideon's cracked beeswax cake rested above them. She dipped a pen and began with the words she had once been afraid to read. My dear one, whoever you are. She described the roof measurements, the mortar ratio, the preserved pane, and the proper heat for ordinary boot cord. She listed the people who had carried food, tools, ash, records, and knowledge to the door. She did not explain how they had saved her. A future reader could understand that from the work they left standing. At the bottom, Eliza recorded one warning. If the room ever became more concerned with its history than with the feet of people still walking, the tools should be packed away until someone remembered their purpose. She did not sign the letter yet. There was more work to learn. Some things wait because they have not finished their work. Outside, walnut catkins moved above the stone marker. Inside, a newly waxed cord cooled beneath linen, and the copper warming lamp made a small circle of light upon the bench. The waxed thread-carding room waits. It has always waited. At the county annex, Mary Ann Vale kept the original dollar bill in the lowest drawer beneath Gideon's parcel map. Its edges had softened, but she never replaced it with another. Once each year, when the property inspection passed, she added the new report beneath it and closed the drawer carefully.